who is a professor of political science at the University College London. And his award-winning research focuses on both international and comparative aspects of gender, sexuality, and social movements. His first book, When States Came Out, Europe's Sexual Minorities and the Politics of Visibility, asks this really important question about why are some norms around LGBT adopted by some countries and not others, and how sexual minorities in some countries have gained new visibility and policy traction. And his recent book, which we'll be presenting today, is The Global Fight Against LGBT Rights, which examines the backlash against LGBT rights, which is also internationally collected and backed by both social movements and conservative governments. So we're delighted to have him here, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I also want to thank Alyssa and Shannon and Tracy for their organizing to bring me here. It was really has been a lovely, lovely trip so far. And as Anna said, I do want to present today a new book with my colleague Christina Stöckel, who's a professor at Luis in Rome and a sociologist of religion. And there's a little bit of a backstory, actually, that we met after one of Anna's talks at the UI in 2013-14, when we were both postdocs there. Anna was presenting a really important work on religion and politics, and in the Q&A we were both asking questions that kind of inspired that we should get a coffee with each other after, and that was a bit of the birthplace of this book, and that's something we talk about in the acknowledgements at the back of it. But this book came out of our joint interest that preceded this work, which was that Christina was writing a book on the norm entrepreneurship of the Russian Orthodox Church, and I was finishing the book that Anna just mentioned around the question of why, how LGBTI activists had used transnational channels to transform the legal and also social landscape in many European states around growing tolerance around LGBT rights. And so what I wanted to do today is actually spend about 5 or 6 minutes just to set up the framework from the old book around transnational activism, because in a way, this second book is a bit of the other side of the coin of that, because we look at how those same transnational tools have interestingly been increasingly deployed by the opposition to LGBT people. And so I'll start with, the question around how transnational activism has led to progressive change, and then I'll look at how transnational activism, unfortunately, also has led to retrenchment or the diffusion of new kinds of policy models that also seek to limit the rights around women's rights and LGBT people's rights in world politics. So the case of LGBTI rights, it's a very interesting one, given that these are quite highly contested norms, even in Europe, where the region where they have maybe taken hold the most. Oftentimes, opposition presents them as a threat to national sovereignty or domestic values, and they're often presented as an outside imposition that comes in to encroach on the domestic space. Yet when while that was very much the narrative when I was starting my PhD in the mid-2000s, we also saw tremendous changes happening, and really surprising ones. For example, Ireland would, in 2015, introduce marriage equality by popular vote. Malta, another Catholic island, is now on the top of the LGBTI indices around trans recognition and also LGBT rights more broadly. These were not the kind of countries, the usual suspects that we usually pinpointed for LGBTI rights. And a lot of the earlier scholarship looked at domestic explanations like high level of democracy or very wealthy countries or very secular countries. So we usually got like to the Netherlands or Sweden, as the kind of cases that got to have LGBT rights. But the puzzle that I was dealing with in this work is trying to think about, these new kinds of misfit cases that started to emerge mainly in Europe, but then also in many other continents that, were adopting things like marriage equality or seeing tremendous changes in the legal framework and also in the social attitudes towards LGBT people that we didn't have pegged as the next most likely cases. So those are a variety of countries that made moves that were unexplained by some of the domestic variables that we thought about. And that led me a little bit to the international relations literature, and there were scholars like Kelly Coleman who did a lot of path-breaking work also in this space, who said that it's not a coincidence that an issue like marriage equality, which existed, we might remember nowhere at the turn of the century in terms of full marriage equality, now exists in multiple dozens of states. So it wasn't that all of these countries met these domestic criteria at the same time. It was also that there's something international going on that we needed to think about. And that led to this, very straightforward argument, I think, that is inspired a lot by work around norms and international relations, that, of course, European states care about also how they signal to their international communities, their international society of states. And there is a rich literature in the diffusion of new norms that might explain why countries adopt similar kinds of policy provisions around the same time. At the same time, there was still a lot of variation that needed to be explained. And so I argued that we have to think about the way that norms are made visible in the domestic space. So a norm might start to emerge at the international level, like in the European Union, but the felt intensity of it might vary across different states depending on 3 international channels that I tested quantitatively and qualitatively to try to make this case around what are the channels that make the norm feel more impactful in some cases versus others. And those channels were social channels, that's the openness to new ideas, information, and images. So some people in the LGBT space called that the Will and Grace effect, because it was a kind of parasocial contact that introduced you to queer people maybe through your TV for the first time, but that might actually, and actually much research has shown, does lead to more openness around these issues. There's also, and you can measure that, the degree to which countries, and there is variation even in Europe, and the circulation of ideas and images, especially if we go back into the Cold War period. Then there's also political channels. That is the degree to which states become open to their international societies of states. And there you can think about joining international organizations. And the EU is here a key example because it is the first international binding laws that we have around sexual orientation came out of the Amsterdam Treaty of the European Union, which was an anti-discrimination directive around workplace, so you couldn't fire someone for coming out. And so that kind of political pressure, of course, can lead states to make moves, especially if they want to join a club of states. They would have to hit certain criteria to get in, and that can have a kind of pressure that leads to changes as well. And then the third channel, which was the most important to me, I think, or that I was most fascinated by, was this mediated transnational channel around activism. And I called these actors norm brokers because they are domestic social movement organizations that nonetheless play this 2-level game, in that they work in these transnational advocacy spaces and they can pull pressure from the outside. They can spotlight, bad behaving governments at home, but at the same time, they know how to talk about LGBT rights in very unique ways across different contexts. So that's why Zimbabweans might use ancient cave paintings to kind of defang queer cave paintings to defang this argument that LGBT rights are a form of neocolonialism. That's why Poles have used Bible verses, sometimes like love thy neighbors at the start of a pride parade. There are ways to make a contentious issue resonant and frame it and package it for given audiences. And so they can play both of these levels, which is to wield international support, but also package it in a right way. And these groups have been around actually since the 19th century. There's been intense transnational ties between queer people, because if you think of the identity of queer people, they can circumvent the national borders quite easily. Other groups can do this too. We can think of women's organizations and movements around racial justice and indigenous rights that do similar things. But a queer person, from Poland might have a lot in common with a queer person from Germany. Even if they've grown up in very different national settings, they might have a basis with which to talk about and politicize some of their identities. And that is indeed something we've seen from very early on. Even the term homosexual was coined by a Hungarian activist in a letter to a German one. So we see these kind of cross-border connections existing for queer people, including with like the World League for Sexual Reform coming at the end of the 19th century that brought activists together around the world. And these kind of ties transnationally might lead to a dynamic, that scholars have called the boomerang or spiral model. Here you see a German cartoon. This is Angela Merkel, the then Chancellor of Germany, and she's trying not to catch a bouquet that says gay marriage, because of course the Irish have now ushered this in on their own. And indeed, the cartoon captures a bit of a boomerang cycle or pressure from the outside, because after that happened, there was a lot of pressure, even from her own parliamentarians, saying, how embarrassing, Germany is supposed to adhere to human rights, and the Irish have beat us to the punch on this, maybe we should rethink this. And indeed, she did release the party whip in 2017. She voted against it herself, but I think she knew full well that it would usher in marriage equality. And at the bottom, you see the word Steilvorlage, which is kind of a perfect pass in soccer, which is, will hit the goal in German. So these kind of dynamics show something international happening. And indeed, these models, these spiral models or boomerang models have led to tremendous changes in Europe, using international courts and a variety of institutions, like a case, for example, that allowed Clay Hamilton and Adrian Roman to have their marriage, which was granted in Belgium, be at least recognized based on the free movement of peoples, that they could live as a couple in Romania, even if Romania wasn't introducing granting marriages themselves. And there's a lot of other examples. You see a picture there of Louisa Wall, who had been trying in the New Zealand parliament to introduce marriage equality bills for quite a while, and no one would grant it, she said, until President Obama said that he evolved on the issue. And after the Americans moved on the issue, you saw about a dozen states in the next year also discuss the issue, and sometimes successfully in their different parliaments. So anyways, that's a bit of the first, the good news story about how these tools can lead to different changes. But I want to get now to the crux of the talk, which is unfortunately also that there is a lot of resistance to LGBT rights. That was certainly also part of the first book, which looked at religion and nationalism and how it also impedes progressive changes in many different states in Europe. But what is new here, or what the new book is trying to make a case for, is that the domestic resistance that is so part and parcel of this work is also being transferred more and more to the international level, that there's more coordination to roll back women's and LGBT rights in different places. And I think this, this image of a beautiful square in Warsaw, where I spent quite a bit of time during my field work, which shows this kind of artist project of a rainbow arch. And that was actually burnt down, it's not there anymore today, but it was burnt down 6 different times. And it's a very tedious project because those are little ribbons, but it was also re-erected 6 different times. So it shows a little bit, the contention around these rights that we sometimes now take for granted. So before talking about the resistance, let's just briefly set the stage for thinking about why do gender and sexuality, why are they so easy to present as this kind of scary threat that might unravel things at home? This is a far-right cartoon that I came across in the mid-2000s from Poland, and it's being ironic here, but it's saying, it's painting a picture that's quite interesting, I think, to understand, how gender and sexuality are painted as outside imposition. Because on the one side, you have, a group of quite normal-looking people waving Polish flags, and it says, so they are fascists. It's being ironic here. And then here on this side, you have a group of folks, I think, also depicting activist and parliamentarian Anna Grodzka carrying a rainbow flag that says "gay is okay." Also having EU flags, which makes a lot of sense since activists took EU flags with them in the mid-2000s, less popular today, but at the time when there was quite a bit of goodwill about joining the EU, that was a key frame, the Europeanization frame. But you also see a Soviet flag there, which makes a lot less sense. But in the imagination of this outside threat, it doesn't matter, because gender and sexuality are always presented as something fluid coming from the outside that can destabilize something more fixed, like national identity or religious identity, which in the imagination are more stable. And so gender and sexuality become this kind of foreign imposition weapon. And while that frame is not new at all, what is new a little bit in terms of how that has been levied more in these international spaces. And it also was unexpected for some of us because it poses some puzzles on how this very nationalist frame can become so transnational, but that's the crux of the new project. And so I want to start on the new project by taking you briefly to one of our fieldwork years, when in 2016 I was in Nicosia at a conference called Reclaiming Family Values, which you might think is a conservative gathering, but it was actually a gathering of LGBTI activists from all around the world, different SMOs getting together to talk about, I quote, how to take the wind out of the sails of their opposition. And a lot of them, they were talking about new frames about how the family is a queer concept, about how we are the children's rights movement because we are protecting children who are stigmatized, et cetera. And so these activists gave impassioned speeches about how to reclaim the family. That same year, in 2016, on May 17th, which in the United States and many countries people know as the International Day Against Homo, Trans, and Biphobia, which is 2 days from now. That year, by decree of the Patriarch in Georgia, it was named a holiday called Family Day. And Christina was in Tbilisi for the World Congress of Families event, which was a setting that also brought together activists from around the world, SMOs who were working on the family, but of course in a very different way than the activists that I was with in Nicosia. Indeed, one of the opening speakers was a Frenchman who first gave some credentials saying that he had 7 children, so definitely credentials for speaking about the family. But then he continued on to say that his country was an example of how the gay lobby was conquering Europe. Despite the resistance of the majority of the population, the government legalized gay marriage, he said. My dear Georgian friends, resist the gay agenda that wants to come here and destroy your families. And so that was, the opening tenor for this meeting. And of course, many politicians also go to these World Congress of Families meetings, et cetera, that talk about strategies on how to unravel the LGBT rights that I spent the first part of the talk discussing. So that vignette of the Tbilisi-Nicosia comparison, I want to use that to argue that these resistances to LGBTI rights have employed some of the same transnational tools that actually garnered LGBT people their recognition. And they even conform to some of the spiral models that we think of in the international relations and political science literature on diffusing rights. But we say that their existence as kind of parallel spiral, which I'll explain in a moment, creates a kind of tension for which we use this double helix metaphor theoretically to say that they bring the 2 spirals into interaction in many places that they wouldn't find themselves in interaction with before. And we also show, by studying the movement quite carefully in the last 10 years, that these resistances unite a quite interesting, maybe strange bedfellows kind of argument of incongruent, both geographically and ideologically incongruent actors that all come together around perceived threats that always intersect with gender, that whether they're threats around communism or demographic decline or nativist panic, gender always features very prominently in their arguments. And their existence also poses some puzzles for political science theory. Of course, many of us thought of the transnational politics as the space for progressive human rights movements, and Christina and I are certainly not the first people to say, to challenge that. That was an idea from the 90s that many have said, of course, these tools can also be used by groups that try to unravel human rights. It's not only human rights groups, but nonetheless, this gender example really powerfully shows that to be the case. It also, of course, challenges some of the optimism around post-material modernity and cosmopolitan secularism that we saw in the literature at some point. And then for me, it was, because this is a bit of a self-critique and something I think I got a bit wrong in the first book, is that I thought that nationalism would be more of an impediment to cross-border organizing. And maybe it is still more of an impediment for these conservative actors than it is for LGBT groups. But nonetheless, we do see this kind of nationalist transnationalism and willingness to cooperate that is quite fascinating in these spaces. And then also for the sociology of religion, the idea that the distinctiveness of different faiths could be such an impediment to a conservative ecumenism is also partly challenged by the actors that we see together in these spaces. And so, the book walks through, and I have the challenge of, presenting to you today these bits and pieces in a very short form, but it's 9 chapters that kind of get through these arguments around that there are rival transnational advocacy networks around this issue, and then also explores, who are the actors, what are the claims, and how do LGBT groups respond, which I think I have about a couple minutes for each of these parts. So the argument that we make here, and Christina and I join a lot of exciting scholars who've done fantastic work that you can see on the bottom here, charting this new movement that's often called the anti-gender movement or the moral conservative movement or the anti-LGBT movement, and that they exist, and are forcefully existing in the last 15 years in various international spaces is now carefully established. What Christina and I try to add to that theoretically is to think about, what the emergence of this new spiral model of anti-human rights does for how we think about the boomerang and the spiral model. And we use this metaphor of the double helix because a helix kind of imagines, you have 2 strands, so we could think of a parallel spiral or a double spiral. But what a helix also has is that there's depth between the 2, which create a space for interaction, which is a bit what we want to focus on here, that if you have an emerging transnational advocacy network, it changes the work of the one that was in that space. And so, for example, the moral conservative transnational advocacy networks, they have copied, and I'll make a case for that in a second, many of the tactics of the LGBTI movement in their symbolism, but also in their frame. So they're much more willing to talk about human rights today than they were before. They're also much more willing to use the international institutions that they critiqued, like international courts. At the same time, the LGBT movement is also put into, forced into an interesting entanglement in that they also are now talking more about the family, more about religion, more about different issues that the moral conservative group has put on the agenda and said that they, accuse the LGBT group of unraveling. And so they talk in turn also more about these different kinds of themes. And so, these are very different movements, and I don't want to make them equivalent in any way because I don't think they are, and I don't think the LGBT activists really care to be in this kind of dynamic. But nonetheless, there is the emergence. It means that you're not only meeting your opposition the way we originally thought in the boomerang model, that progressive groups mobilize, then they try to convince a misbehaving state that might eventually, they might be in denial, but might eventually be persuaded. What this dynamic would mean, though, is that they're not just meeting their opposition in those domestic spaces. They're meeting them at the local and national, but also at the international level and different international courts and different IOs, where they also confront this challenge. And that naturally, creates what we call kind of a mirroring strategy, and that they actually learn from each other's tactics and also have to respond to each other in a movement-counter-movement dynamic that might exist there. So who are these actors? Well, there's a lot of varied actors in this movement that we call the transnational moral conservative movement. The ones we focus on the most in the book, which I think are the key ones, include the International Organization of the Family. They organize these World Congress of Families events. Their president is Brian Brown, that was doing actually some work in California, and that he was the president of the National Organization for Marriage and was really pushing around Prop 8 back in 2008. If you remember, that was a successful attempt to prohibit marriage equality in the U.S. And that a lot of American activists that were fighting the culture wars here also saw a kind of some appeal to transnationalizing their work and work focusing on more winnable countries where they could pursue some of their policies. And the National Organization for the Family is one example of that. There's also a European group founded in Spain called Citizen Go. That's a digital transnational advocacy network. Some of you might know MoveOn.org or Avaz. This would be the conservative counterpart. And so they claim to have 12 million followers, and they translate in 17 different languages. So you could get some very basic petition about drag queen story hour in Florida that will then be translated in Brazil and in Bavaria, and that politicians all over will have to engage with it. There's a variety of other groups around Agenda Europe, global homeschooling, et cetera. And there's also one called the Political Network for Values, which is a Latin American group that really focuses on politicians specifically on how to use gender. And so they bring together far-right politicians to talk about how to win campaigns by, targeting women's and LGBT rights. And of course, there's states and IOs that are also involved in this, just like in the traditional human rights TAN, you might have norm-entrepreneur states. The Russian state has obviously been doing a lot of work in this space. You might have international organizations like the Orthodox and Catholic Church that have been quite involved in different degrees over time that really also support these movements these transnational movements that do this work. And you can see, that this network, this is from a network analysis, which is actually quite hard to see on the screen, but blue circles are, countries that have hosted an event, and orange triangles are countries that send SMOs to these World Congress of Families event. And all that you need to take away from it is really that, these lines crisscross the globe, and so these events are truly quite transnational. There's also a lot of, in this map here, these are the UN's resolutions that are anti-LGBT. So the red states are doing something progressive by voting against the LGBT resolution. But you can see here that also the civil society groups that sponsored them, they are really mixed in all of these cases. So we can't really divide the world up neatly as like anti-gay and pro-gay or anti-LGBT, pro-LGBT states. There's a lot of variation here also in the way that civil society is based sometimes in states that we might think of as more LGBT friendly, that is doing a lot of this work to unravel LGBT rights. And even if we look more closely, this is within the network analysis of the various groups that take part in the key norm entrepreneurs. You see a lot of countries represented from the United States, Nigeria, Venezuela, Spain, Canada, Russia. There's a lot of civil society groups that take part in these events that truly have a global reach. And so what are their claims, or what are the conversations there? A lot of that is captured by this concept of so-called gender ideology, or this fear around gender ideology. This is a slide that I could truly update every few days right now, because there's a lot more examples of it always coming. But the way my colleagues Roman Kuar and David Paternot defined gender ideology is that it is perceived as this ideological matrix of unwanted social reforms, namely around sexual and reproductive rights, same-sex marriage and adoption, new reproductive technologies, sex education, gender mainstreaming, protection against gender violence, and increasingly also focused on opposition to trans inclusion. And so this kind of wide umbrella of things around, bundled around this idea of gender ideology, we see crop up in a variety of different ways. One, there's these, so-called bans on gay propaganda, which we see diffusing from state to state, including within the European Union. But you can also see, a variety of outputs of this kind of work, whether we can look at our executive orders here in the United States from the Trump administration that names gender ideology, or you can see, a couple weeks ago, Hungary banned pride parades. They already adopted a kind of anti-gay propaganda bill in 2021 that was reminiscent of the Russian model from 2012 and 2014. You can see that in Georgia last year, there was this kind of foreign agent law where civil society groups that work on LGBT rights are defined as foreign agents, which is also happening in many states, the Russian state being a key one, or sometimes even extremists or terrorist groups get that label. And these claims are articulated in a variety of ways. This is just for a moment of levity, kind of a lighter one. You see a German campaign from Citizen Go, which says stop the LGBT indoctrination through Lego. So this is a campaign against the toy maker, which also exists in a lot of countries because they have this rainbow colored toy. You also can see, this development of symbolism. And this was really fascinating. One interview, or actually came up in a couple, but one interviewee said, that the LGBT groups, they have this rainbow flag and everyone can see the flag and they know what it means. And we also are developing a flag. And so this is the output, which you can get in pink or blue. It's called the natural families flag, or the heterosexual pride flag. And you can see that also existing as a symbol in different places to kind of define, a different kind of model. And I just want to spend now my last minutes on how LGBT groups have also responded to this. So the LGBT movement, which I'm really not giving the space here in this talk since I've been focused on their opposition, is a very agile movement that has went through in the last centuries already a lot of opposition that they've navigated. So they're responding in new and agile ways, and there's also a lot of contestation within the movement around how they're responding in some ways to this movement. But one of the things we notice in the book is that we do a content analysis where we look at changes in the way the movement, at least at the transnational level, talks about their rights. And what we see there is an uptick in the LGBT movement has always talked about family, but we see an uptick in uses of the family, and the use of children, and the use of religion, and the use of even national frames, which we call kind of rooted frames. And that is quite antithetical to LGBT activism, because they were always seen as outside of the nation and often are deeply anti-national. But the Polish group KPH, for example, changed their logo to the borders of the Polish state. Now it's a rainbow border, but nonetheless, it does have this national rooting. We also see a variety of kind of strategies that change the way the movement works to some degree. So here you can see this "Let Us Show Each Other Sign of Peace" campaign coming out of led by KPH, but a variety of groups, including progressive Catholic groups, that led this campaign in 2016 in Poland, which shows someone with a rosary shaking the hand of someone with a rainbow, ribbon bracelet. Thank you. My jet lag, I guess, is still lingering after all. But and it's what you say, of course, to each other in Catholic Mass, but it also is resonant because in 1965, Polish bishops wrote a letter to German Catholic bishops saying, and it had that on the top of it, let it show each other a sign of peace, or let's move on from some of our differences. You see also these frames, pop up in a variety of countries in response. So here you can see this was an anti-marriage LGBT or marriage equality frame in Ireland. And you see here this, kind of common phrasing that it says children deserve a mother and a father. But in kind of a nice story, the family that was the stock that they used the stock image of, when they found out that they were on these posters, they modeled for the Yes campaign, which was the pro-marriage equality campaign, and they're on this poster. But interestingly, there the framing too for marriage equality is fascinating in that it centers, that children deserve equality. And of course, that makes perfect sense, that given that children of queer parents often face certain types of stigma in school. Of course, we know that queer children themselves have very high rates of homelessness, of self-harm, et cetera. And so these, the movement has always been focused on children, but there's also, specific attempts more and more to center some of these frames of the opposition. So that's a little bit the different parts of the book. I'll just mention briefly, a key scope condition is that we focused on this tension between the LGBT rights activists and the moral conservative activists. That is a bit of a simplification. I mean, both in the way this metaphor works, because there's a lot of groups that crisscross these strands, but also the moral conservative group does focus also very much on women's rights, and women's rights groups are also really responding to it, which we didn't spend, as much, we didn't have as much space and time to study, but they increasingly focus on LGBTI people. It's a key component of their messaging, but it always, goes part and parcel of this gender ideology frame with an attack on women's rights, which we also see, of course, developing. Anyone who's watching the news, whether the Dobbs decision or kind of rollbacks on women's reproductive rights, and also on a variety of provisions to protect women from domestic violence, et cetera, that become, key claims that these groups also try to mobilize against. And what Christina and I did, when we met at the UI, we were working on a grant application, and Christina was the PI of a project with 3 different strands, and then I was on this LGBT strand, and we unfortunately got funding to work on this project, which we then spent almost a decade on, but we did 120 interviews with moral conservative advocates, and that was kind of paralleled with the work that I had been doing for quite a long time already with LGBT activists, so that we could think about this dynamic between the two. And I really have Christina to thank for all of that, because as someone who has really worked, I had much less access because I had already been working on LGBT rights. I was a little bit incognito in the project for a while, and she had these really important connections that provided us access. And for folks like me who work on gender and LGBT rights, often we can't really spend as much time, in those spaces. And so it was a very, very fulfilling collaboration. And and that's what the book looks like. There's these, different chapters that try to focus on, the very short vignettes that I gave you of the different parts, and in terms of how this movement works, and also those centrally in how LGBTI activists respond to it, which I think is really something we can't lose sight of, that this is not, necessarily a, one side winning or other, even if the editors of the press did put the word fight in the title. There are really important efforts also in place to resist some of these attacks on LGBT rights. So I'll just thank you for your attention now, and I will, I think I'm right on time, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. We'll open it for Q&A. Go ahead.
Would you surmise that Europe LGBT right is more progressive than us in the United States? I know we're California, we're very progressive.
Yeah.
United States compared to Europe.
Yeah, actually, yes, I would surmise that. I mean, there's even a book by Angelia Wilson called, Why Europe is LGBT friendly and America never will be. That did come before the Obama administration, but the United States is a very interesting case, because there's been, and like you point to California, there's been so much central activism in the United States that has really led the way. I mean, the historically, most of the activism was in Europe. So the 19th century activism, a lot of which was snuffed out in the Second World War by National Socialism, save for one group in Switzerland. That was very much a European-led movement. And after the Second World War as well, the Dutch really picked up. So you saw kind of the epicenter moving from Berlin to Amsterdam. And a lot of the transnational organizations were rooted in Europe. Even the first US group in 1924 was in Chicago, was a protege of Magnus Hirschfeld in Berlin. Yet with Stonewall and with the 1960s, the Americans really took the lead in terms of social movements and this new kind of more forceful queer liberation or gay liberation repertoire that was much more using visibility politics. But the American, at the federal level in the US, there was always quite a bit of resistance. And the Europeans were making, in different states, were making progress that was unimaginable in the US. And I mean, the US decriminalized homosexuality in 2003 at the federal level, which most European states did in the 60s. So the US was really seen as quite a laggard in the global landscape of LGBT rights. And I think the Obama administration changed some of that in that the US really, kind of started leading the way. And we see also in the foreign policy apparatus, it has become, until with the Trump administration, there was always kind of a big of a zigzag, but it was also starting to be more forceful globally and being a voice for LGBT rights as part of foreign policy. But the Europeans are historically kind of the origins of what we can think of, at least the contemporary Western style LGBTI identity-based movements, and they have provided a lot of the infrastructure and models for those rights that have shaped, I think, global politics on the issue.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I was wondering, I found it very interesting when you talked about groups learning from each other. And I was wondering, what do you think about the groups from the Global South? Do you think they are also learning and sending out the same messages? Because I can see the regional differentiation and also what is important for them, and there are different laws, of course. So I'm just curious, from your research, what do you think about that?
No, that's fantastic. And I focused a little bit more on the European story for the audience today. I mean, we did also work with groups that work in the Global South. And I think there's two ways to answer that question. One, we do see kind of a set of master frames that develop at the transnational level. They're contested, they don't work everywhere. But what is so important about that norm broker concept is that they can be applied in different ways in different states. And I think actually both the pro and anti-LGBT groups do that, but there are some similarities. So for example, my colleague or our colleague soon, Adam Harris, and I have been working on this project. We did survey experiments with some Zimbabwean activists that are using these cave paintings, and they're basically trying to say that, queer politics are indigenous. They've been here for a while. We have these queer cave paintings, and indeed British colonialism brought a lot of homophobic laws to the continent. Yet they are still responding to this neo-colonial frame, which we have in many different countries where LGBT people are presented as foreign opposition. So in Poland, it's colonialism from Brussels, or as my colleagues have charted, they've called it Ebola, done research on how it's presented as Ebola from Brussels. Many Polish colleagues working in that space that use a similar kind of anti-colonial frame in different states, and that applies also in Latin America and different places. So there's some similarities, but then there's always also specificity. I mean, we haven't come far enough along on LGBT rights, and it's still new enough that the gap between global North and global South, well, yes, it is there in some respects. It's also quite blurry, and there's some global South states like the Latin American ones that have really led the way in part, or leapfrogged a lot of the countries in the global North. So it's this kind of interesting mix of framing. There's a lot of collaboration transnationally. So a lot of these events, like the International Lesbian, Gay, Bi, Trans, and Intersex Association, which I actually forgot to mention, is it's the longest enduring transnational advocacy organization. It was founded in 1978, and they bring activists together, biannual summits that span the globe. And then they also have different regional groups that meet usually on different schedules on their own. So there will be an ILGA Europe group, and then an ILGA Latin America group, et cetera. And they also coordinate on those different levels, but always then usually coordinate together transnationally at some stages as well.
My question is about the intersectionality on the other side, on the attackers, and the one that who kind of making campaigns against the LGBT rights. There are groups within that and this anti-campaign bloc that is right now kind of making political flirtations with some parts of the LGBT.
Yeah.
There are, there's a hierarchy also, as we know it within the LGBT community, in the queer community, the kind of gay guys and the trans ones, and there's communities involved. So, I mean, is there any discussion about that? Since that we also observe that these so-called white groups are right now kind of have a common ground with the far-right arguments about the anti-LGBT legislations and anti-LGBT kind of campaigns. J.D. Vance said that, there's a normal gay. Yeah. And then we know that the Peter Thiel is financing, he is himself a gay. Campaign of the Trump administration. So is there any kind of a discussion of the strategies of divide and conquer kind of in the discussion in your book?
That's a fantastic question. I'm really glad you brought it because we do talk about intersectionality a lot in the book. It's something I'm deeply committed to and interested because you're right to say that even looking at the world, we have quote unquote won for LGBT rights. There are huge power differentials, and a lot of it has been structured around upper middle class white gay men. In the West, there's definitely been, differences in how these rights have applied, rights of lesbian women or rights of trans people, which have been so central to the movement in all of these stages. And often we're always, kind of told to wait the turn because this is just too controversial, et cetera. And so that applies very much to the first argument when we think about how rights are kind of championed in different places, but it also applies in terms of how we think about this new contestation here, where there is the propensity to form some kind of cross-strand, alliances in this double helix. And so in London, on the street where all these conservative organizations sit, there's also a group called the LGBT Alliance, which is a conservative LGBT group, I guess, gay, lesbian, bisexual group that very explicitly, severs off trans rights. And the irony there, is that they use a lot of these gender ideology arguments that are coming from the right. It's hard for me to square kind of intellectually and how these same arguments that were levied against gay and lesbian people, as in like, this is just not natural, or this is a threat to children, or this is against common sense or against religion. Those are arguments that, of course, are being applied to trans people, and that there are these weird borrowing effects. We see that also with some women's movements that have, the UK being a key case for that, where I live right now with a very, very problematic court case that was passed, that really brings biological essentialism back, which is, of course, what women's rights movements also fought against for quite a while, that had brought us centrally back to enshrine in law these differences. So we can see, and that's something that's very concerning about some of these gender ideology frames. They are alluring to wide swaths of populations. They do resonate with people, including some people who work on gender and sexuality. And so it does create, a really complex, space to weed through when we think of it, intersectionally. At the same time, I spent quite a bit of time with LGBT advocates, and I really feel that those groups that are severing off, trans people who are borrowing this language are very much in the minority. And we can see that in data too with younger generations. That there's some really interesting work by Claire Thurlow in the UK who talks about some of these fractures based on kind of emotion and nostalgia, but also shows that with younger generations of intersectional feminism, that is, very much, I think within the movement, there's quite a bit of sensitivity and critique to not borrowing those far right languages. And it does, make me feel assured that, that I don't think these fractures are like widespread. But of course, when we think of how the vote can be mobilized with homonationalism or pinkwashing or different strategies, which the Trump administration has also had with Trump pride, while of course actively unraveling LGBT rights, can resonate with some people who might be the normal case that you mentioned. And I don't think data shows that is a widespread phenomena, that there are many, many normal gays that are voting for Trump, but it nonetheless is something that is concerning. And it's kind of, I guess it's a liability of, or kind of a peril of becoming a little bit part of the mainstream, and some that we can also be co-opted into kind of national projects or racist projects or others that kind of split us apart. And that's something that queer scholars and feminist scholars have warned about, a long time that, you know, rights have a downside, and that can be that.
Hi, I'm Liana. Thank you so much for this presentation. This is really fascinating. I'm kind of interested in hearing your perspective on just broadly how the mechanism of how a largely homophobic population grows to accept gay rights, and which specific aspects of the movement are most successful in achieving that. So whether it's like the public media campaigns or increased awareness or just the greater presence of gay people. I'm specifically curious, and extremely homophobic places like Uganda or Nigeria, how do you imagine that this road to increased gay rights could be played out, and using the historical examples of other places?
Thank you, Leona. I mean, that's such an important question. It's one that's hard to research, but I do have a bit of speculative feelings about it. I mean, I do think that the visibility of queer people, and visibility is also a bit of a double-edged sword, because visibility can also shine a light on marginalized communities and focus more violence towards them. So it's also really tricky. But the visibility that we saw emerge in the last 2 decades in some countries, like this one, has helped really dismantle some homophobic attitudes in really interesting ways, in that, you know, LGBT people emerged and could tell their story in a way that crisscrossed different segments of society. So there were conservatives that had queer kids, there were people who were, you know, Republicans, Democrats, there were poor people and rich people, or there were people across different races that all had to grapple with kind of the emergence of loved ones around them that were queer. And that was something that the movement really worked on with this kind of love is love frame and other kind of frames, to kind of show that queer people exist and are in people's lives. And I think that that has led to one of these, you know, major social transformations, maybe around social justice movements. It's been one of the most transformative in the years since even I was, you know, in high school or writing this, but there's been so much change. And none of us thought that we would be in countries, you know, would be over half the population would support something like marriage equality not long ago. That is very, very new. And I think that the kind of emergence of the movement and the ability to finally have some kind of role models, and the media, of course, plays a role in that as well, or kind of see people that you care about and admire, you know, in close proximity to you, that has been very powerful for LGBT groups. And the fact that they've crisscrossed a lot of different spaces has made that really powerful. I don't want to, though, by saying that, I don't want to kind of take away that, you know, there are different obstacles to coming out for different groups, and it's not equally easy. And so to go to your Uganda example there too, you know, it's very, very hard. And sometimes invisibility strategies like Ashley Currier's work argues this are really necessary for LGBT groups as well, because it's not always safe to kind of levy a campaign and be out. And so in Uganda, you have, you have, unfortunately, this frame that is actually quite similar to some of the arguments that I presented in other countries today, that LGBT people are kind of a quote unquote Western decadence. They're coming from the outside, and they're going to mess with the way we understand life and our values here. There are nonetheless a lot of important Ugandan LGBT activists and queer activists who are, you know, challenging that narrative, and indeed also challenging it productively in many cases. But it's really tough to do that in a context where you have so much elite messaging kind of legitimizing these very homophobic arguments. And I think that in other spaces where that has been unraveled a little bit, at least for the gay and lesbian rights, where it's no longer as powerful of an argument to win elections, that you can have you know, some of those movement effects play out more readily. I hope it's a very big question, but we can talk more. We can talk more after. Yeah.
I'm going to insert myself.
Sure.
See, I'm sort of wondering about the shift in strategies over time. Because once, you know, there's an argument that gay activists, for example, went from a relatively confrontational strategy in the 80s and early 90s to this sort of, you know, we just want to pay taxes and have kids like everybody else and live, you know, the will and grace, totally boring life.
Yeah.
And that's what's responsible for this, the enormous success, right? This huge flip in public opinion about, for example, marriage equality. And so I'm wondering about trans activists, right? Because they appear to be in the confrontational phase, in the sense that, you know, it's genocide, it's violence, everything is in these very sort of vivid, ramped up terms that a lot of times may not resonate as well. In terms of wondering what the story here is, like sort of that transformation over time, and where is sort of trans activism in that story without imposing a teleology?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's such a good question because, also just in queer activism more broadly, there have been these very big changes, like in the homophile movement, it was very respectability politics, which also didn't work that well in that era, but very much kind of behind closed doors, behind the scenes. And not being kind of out in the streets, which then gay liberation was this much more forceful activism, which was in the streets, which also included a lot of trans activists in that process, and also trans activist groups in the 70s that had this much more forceful mantle. The 80s was then an interesting period because it really became life and death with the HIV/AIDS crisis, where people were willing to use very, targeted practices because there was just no attention being given. But I think that there's certainly something to say for this kind of mainstreaming discourse, and marriage equality ended up being such an important ticket in that, because marriage equality was also quite critiqued by queer groups for a long time. People said, we don't want to have this institution because it can be quite misogynistic. It can be, we want, like the more radical position that you stake out is to say we don't want those rights. We want to free everyone from it. And then there was, of course, a big move in the 90s to thinking that maybe we can try these different strategies. And my intuition is that they do work to some degree, even though they're hotly contested amongst LGBT people. So you can have ads, for example, that don't even feature queer people, like the Irish ones that had adorable Irish grandmas talking about their gay grandkids with rosaries, but nonetheless not really showing queer people. Those happen in Washington State here too, and other places, where to really focus on marriage, which is a very conservative institution. And then you have kind of the Pete Buttigieg type characters, you have a white picket fence and very traditional. And so this has always been contested a bit among activists. There's a fear that it leaves out, some of the most queer among us that don't get to be liberated. But on reaching wide swaths of audience, it's super effective, and it does work, I think. And that is always, thinking about different audiences and trying to find a balance. And I think queer groups are pretty good at doing that, to speaking to like wider societal changes in some cases, to also focusing on left behind groups and others. When it comes to trans activism, I think we're in a bit of a space now where we don't have as much, the debate has become so intense that it's sucked out some of the oxygen. And many trans activists themselves say, we really just want to talk about violence against trans people, against hate crimes. And then we are in a space where, any conversation about framing strategies also feels so sensitive, because we're, as we know with LGBT rights, often groups don't have to ask for very much to have a full-on attack come if it feels politically expedient for some groups. So, a lot of these, really hot topic issues that the conservative politicians have brought up are issues that are also really amplified in a way that make, trans people feel very vulnerable. There's a lot of bills that levied at them, even though I have to say that, it hasn't been it hasn't always been the most radical bills coming from trans activists themselves, or positions. There are always some voices that get amplified and get spotlighted then in that process by also the opposition. So it does feel like I don't fully know the answer to the question right now, because it does feel like a unique kind of situation where in some countries where LGBT groups have won, or at least LGB groups have won rights, it feels like politicians can now use some of those old frames to target trans people, including in places where trans people are not asking for very much at all. And then they're in this conundrum where they have to fight back against these frames, while having a lot of that discourse dictated by their opposition. I do think, though, that there is potentially there needs to be a way to think about framing changes. And I think a lot of activists in the LGBT space want to talk about that. It's just very sensitive and hard to talk about when you see things like the court case, or I think in the US right now, there's over 400 anti-trans bills in motion, and they're often connected in different states. And they're often connected to kind of mega conservatives and others that make it really, really hard to position out the space. So yeah, it's a really tough situation.
My question is a bit related to something that was brought up earlier. I was wondering about relationships between these networks and political parties, and specifically far-right parties, whether it's sort of always the case that these far-right parties are sort of part of that network or close to them. And specifically in that context, I was thinking about the fact that some of these far-right parties have gay people that are quite high up, sometimes the leader or the deputy leader or so. Do these parties take different positions on gay issues, or Do these gay politicians in these far-right parties somehow display some kind of
Yeah.
schizophrenia or something?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of all of what you said, but so first of all, yes, I mean, there is a lot of political representation at these events. I mean, one of the groups, the Political Network for Values, is specifically for politicians and far-right politicians specifically, but even the other groups that I mentioned, like the World Congress of Families, like Giorgia Meloni opened the one in Torino. I mean, that was before she was before she was elected, but still I mean, you see a lot of important politicians are involved in these spaces and hosting these spaces. Very important political leadership is connected to them. And also a lot of the funding comes from states and also, well, charitable giving as well, that's quite high, that connects them a lot to the political establishment. In terms of the parties, and I mean, this is a dynamic that we see mainly now in Western Europe, and I guess also in some countries that have reached a certain threshold of gay and lesbian rights, where you see that the far right can have these candidates that also ally themselves close to, far, like who are LGBT, but ally themselves close to far politics. And so here in Germany, Alice Weidel is the chair, co-chairwoman of the AfD, is a lesbian woman who interestingly lives in a binational, biracial family, but nonetheless has said, uses this very in the literature, this concept of homonationalism really applies here. Use this argument saying that she is, there not despite her homosexuality, but because of it, is what that's a quote from her. And she said that it's, because she wants to protect German gay people from migrants who might feel differently about homosexuality. And so that is, of course, a way to kind of stereotype migrants as being more homophobic. And it's been used for a while. I mean, I guess starting with Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands already, a couple decades ago, that used these kind of homonational narratives to say we want to protect our Dutch gays, and we can use LGBT rights in a far-right discourse to exclude other people that we might think of as threatening to LGBT rights. And so that mainly means protecting then the kind of white, normal gays that are ethnically linked to the state, and then use it as a pretext for far-right politics to exclude others. And we see the same with femonationalism and other kinds of dynamics that I think make it, it does feel like a schizophrenia, as you said, or like some kind of a mismatch, but it does seem to work. It also provides a way for these far-right parties to maybe signal that, oh, we're not that bigoted, like the Trump pride, part of the campaign, which he really didn't take part in that. I mean, that was Tiffany Trump's portfolio, I think, was to go around quite disastrously, but it was a way, I don't think it was to win over a lot of LGBT people. In that case, it was a way for people who want to vote for Trump to have a kernel to say, well, maybe he's not as bigoted to their LGBT family members. But I mean, we see these kind of politics play out in different ways. And I think in Western Europe, we also can see that LGBT voters can be mobilized in part, by some of these anti-migration frames. These also connect often to Islamophobia in Europe, that these far-right gay and lesbians offer kind of a mantle for those arguments.
Do we have
Yeah,
time?
of course, we have time, absolutely.
I have a methodological question that this also includes the Middle East as well, or parts of Turkey too, that I'm curious, because it seems that Turkey isn't pivoting into something new since 2015 with the new crackdowns on the LGBT prides and the communities and the advocacy networks in Turkey. Turkey is in a kind of a path of almost, if not maybe fully, but criminalizing of the LGBT activism. And it's kind of, we see that moment is Russia is very powerful in terms of financing maybe even, but kind of certainly as a symbol example of the stronghold of anti-LGBT politics. So how is this kind of played out into a whole global thing? And I mean, the Middle East is also part of that too.
We see it a lot in the Middle East. So I mean, in Jordan and Lebanon, there have been bills introduced to kind of restrict sex education or kind of queer content from schools. Turkey is maybe a key example, which really forcefully Erdogan using the gender ideology language as a way to crack down on queer communities. I mean, if we go beyond that, we see also a wave of kind of emulation of policy provisions in Africa, for example, too, where there it is becoming even LGBT expression or advocacy is becoming criminalized under these laws. Just in the last 2-3 years, we've seen a variety of different policies, and that's a little bit what we're trying to get at with the double helix, is that it's not just LGBT activists who are taking issues like anti-discrimination or marriage equality or adoption rights and diffusing them from country to country, but we also see these models that are working across borders. And Christina, I did write another piece for the Journal of Democracy looking specifically at authoritarians, which we don't work so much on in the book, or we don't spotlight as much in the book, and how it can be used as such an effective strategy in a variety of different states, and including global South states are using it. In terms of the financing, which I think that was the hardest part for us, we do talk about it in the book, but it was very hard to track because a lot of these funding flows, I mean, there's some work like Neil Data's work, which focuses particularly on Europe, has done a great job in kind of trying to look at this, to basically point out the funding is very ample for the moral conservative group. There's also groups like the Global Philanthropy Project that estimate the funding of these anti-LGBT groups to be in the multiple folds of that of the global LGBT movement. So basically the consensus is that it's very high, but it's hard for us to know exactly how much. I mean, my former student, Christopher Velasco, who's a sociologist now at Princeton, he's doing some interesting work on IRS contributions. And so he can track like charitable giving to countries like Uganda around the time of anti-LGBT policies to kind of show that there's quite a bit of funding flows, but it's hard when you want to look at it globally and look at where the funding is coming from a variety of different countries. But it's really, it really does seem to be quite plush that there's a lot of resources for these movements to also help put this on the agenda of different countries. I mean, of course, the countries themselves have some agency here, and this is a big point of our Will Rouse new book, which is fantastic, Out of Time, that is saying, well, there's something international going on with the anti-LGBT movement, but it also takes certain folks in different countries, to levy those campaigns. But there is quite a bit of willingness because I think it does seem to work. It resonates. I mean, it doesn't work all the time, and we also have a lot of good news studies that show that in some countries, using these anti-LGBT messages hurts you in elections, but in many parts of the world, it does still seem to offer, some kind of resonance, that a way to distract from, policies not working out in other domains, for example, that can be used. And I think the Middle East is certainly a case where that's taking place.
Thank you so much. This is fantastic.
Thank you.